We're looking at the Church of England and what happened at the General Synod in its meeting last week. There were discussions on safeguarding, problems selecting bishops, various commentary on the position of bishops in the Church of England, and generally whether the Synod did anything to impress the country at large, because the Church of England has taken quite a beating in the last few months. And joining us to discuss it are journalists who are present at the Synod: Francis Martin from the Church Times, Susie Leafe from Anglican Futures, and Andrew Carey from the Church of England newspaper. So I think, first of all, we should pay tribute to Clive Billinus, who was a key member of the Synod, and he was a frequent visitor to these briefings. And in fact, he took part in our last briefing, which we did just before the Synod started. He died tragically, suddenly, on the way home from Synod last weekend. So I'm sure we're all wanting to pass on our condolences to his family and friends. I'm sure he would have joined us and has something to say about everything we're about to discuss today. But we're going to start with the bishops. We're starting with them because no sooner had everyone gone home from the Synod than we get yet another headline from the Church of England, which is that the nominee for the vacancy for the Bishop of Durham has suddenly withdrawn. We don't know who that person was. We don't know the circumstances of it, but it was still startling news. I wonder, Francis, if we can come to you first and just ask you on that what you made of that when you saw the headline.
Well, like most people, I wasn't quite sure what to make of it. I mean, the initial reaction I think a lot of people had was this was somehow related to Synod. I think that might be perhaps misleading. This is all guesswork. I mean, and there's nothing that journalists like as much as some juicy speculation on something as dramatic as this. I mean, and I've seen any number of different theories. I was just today, someone was suggesting that it was because the nominated person didn't like the house that was on offer. So, there are plenty of theories out and about there. What to make of them, I'm not entirely sure. What it certainly seems to point to, though, is that there is this there's a sort of febrile atmosphere at the moment, especially when it comes to the appointment of bishops and sort of functioning of power in the church more generally. And this only exacerbates that feeling.
Susie, have you heard anything on the quiet about why this happened?
I haven't heard anything about why it's happened. I think it feels to me, I've seen all the sort of rumours that Francis is describing. I just think it's a time not to get into those sort of things. We just don't know. We really don't know. In the past, when people have stepped back from these things, it's been due to illness or due to family circumstances just as much as it is due to the church politics. We just didn't necessarily know that it happened because CNC was a lot less transparent. We didn't know when they met. We didn't know when they were announcing things. This one seems to have been going on for some time. So whether there's been concerns for a while, who knows?
Andrew, perhaps we can ask you the same question. Do you know anything on the quiet about why this has happened?
No, I'm none the wiser. I can't really add anything to what anyone else has. If they've pulled out as a matter of protest, I'd be quite surprised at that because it's you're bound by confidentiality. You can't make any sort of statement. So it's
it plays into the larger debate that there was at Synod about the problem appointing bishops, and that there are now 8 vacancies, which is a fifth of the total number of bishops. There are 42. What are the issues? I mean, there was one intervention from Charlie Bell, who said that the Living in Love and Faith, the dispute over same-sex blessings, was being weaponised on the appointments boards, the Crown nominations commissions that were set up to appoint bishops. And this meant that the evangelicals didn't want anyone liberal to get the job. Is that correct?
I think that theological differences have always played a part in the way that the CNC works. I mean, and if you remember the absolute outcry when Philip North was appointed as a diocesan bishop, which led to him standing down, and that was due to theological differences. People couldn't believe that somebody who didn't himself ordain women could be a diocesan bishop. So I think weaponising is a little bit strong, but I think people are going to have those things have always taken a part and should take a part in the sense that we are appointing the people who are going to uphold the doctrine and teaching of the church. So their understanding of the doctrine and teaching of the church obviously should come into it.
I mean, it is serious. It's theological differences or other differences are preventing bishops being even put forward. But, the Staley to agree twice in Ely and Carlisle. So those are vacant now. And now we've got Durham, where there was one nomination and that's gone to the board. What does it say about the process?
Yeah, I think there's been something of a panic over 2 failed appointments, and that's the way I'd see it. That something has gone wrong with the process somewhere, clearly. Or alternatively, you can read it as the process going right because the wrong candidates came.
We haven't had it for the last 15 years, was one of the points, Andrew, that, twice in 12 months for it to go wrong compares with twice in the last 15 years. So what is going wrong?
My thesis for this briefing, if you like, is that, perhaps we're moving into a healthier place now post coercive controlling environment of the last decade. And so I would put it down to that. I think there has been a controlling, centralising force in the Church of England, and I think it's healthy that that's over. I don't assign that solely to Justin Welby, but I think there's been a tendency to regard national church as a kind of government, and what we're seeing is a reassertion of the local and the diocesan over against national church, which is a fiction.
It sort of goes to the point, which I think is quite important, that we're seeing sort of proxy battles over LLF play out in different areas of church life. And it doesn't mean to say that those bishops' appointments in Ely and Carlisle were necessarily to do with LLF. But you just have to sort of sit and watch Synod for a day to notice that in a lot of debates that have ostensibly nothing to do with LLF, the dividing lines on the Synod floor are drawn between those that we know from interminable LLF debates are on opposite sides of that particular argument.
Can I just ask you a question about how you saw the way that the votes went on the changes to how the Crown Nominations Commission should work in its voting? And all of the proposals put forward by the Bishop of London that came from the bishops were voted down, and the others that came from the Commission were voted for.
Those proposals put forward by the bishops for the changes of CNC, I think were done back in October, November, didn't they come out sometime around then? And I think it was a bit of a panic reaction. And I think it was done within the context of the bishops' meeting. And they may have seemed really reasonable to them. They may have, as a college of bishops sitting down and saying, well, actually, these are practical, pragmatic ways in which we could make it simpler for a choice to be made. And I think it shows that they were slightly tone deaf, that they didn't hear that their proposals were basically placing vast amounts of power in the hands of the bishops themselves and taking it away from the diocese. So I don't think it's just that people are not respecting the office of bishop in the way that they used to in some sort of deferential way. I think it is also that the bishops are in a more difficult place, and I think they're a bit tone deaf to the way they're being perceived.
At the very start of the Synod, it was the first time the Synod had met since the Archbishop of Welby resigned and the Bishop of Liverpool retired. What did you make of the very first day's debate, Susie, when the Archbishop of York gave his presidential address?
The intervention before the Archbishop of York's address, yes. So Stan Mulgrave putting through an amendment to move to next business on the basis that the Archbishop of York had been called out by bishops, had been called out by the media, had been called out by all sorts of people for not necessarily being suitable for the job. Obviously, he didn't win the motion didn't go through, but I think it is noticeable that I think about 20% of Synod voted in favour of the motion. About another 10% said, well, we're going to abstain, and about another 10% weren't in the room. So that would suggest that 40% of Synod can't actually positively say they want to hear from the Archbishop of York as the president of Synod. I don't think it affected I think the fact he won it actually probably gave him a little bit more confidence through Synod, rather than him reflecting on the idea that maybe there were quite a few people who were concerned about his position. What did you think, Francis, about the way that was reported?
I thought it was quite interesting. I mean, part of the interest was we haven't had a vote before on whether people want to hear a presidential address. And part of me wondered, if we did this every synod, I wonder what proportion. We don't have a baseline really for how many people don't want a presidential address. And so it was a little bit difficult, I think, to extract purely from that vote the level of opposition to or disquiet with the Archbishop of York's position. My sense was that reporting was slightly coloured by the fact that in the days before the synod began, there'd been a lot of chatter about various protests that were slated to take place, and I'm sure Susie and Andrew will have heard those kind of rumours as well and suggestions as well. And there was a lot of talk in particular about a walkout, and so when that happened, when the presidential debate started, I was obviously watching keenly on the synod floor to see who was walking out. It was rather underwhelming. A few people got up and left, but it was hard to, there's always people coming and going in synod debates. It was hard. It certainly wasn't a kind of a performative walkout.
For me, I thought the most significant thing was that synod opened with public prayers. I thought that synod was shocked. That was the mood. For me, that was the story. It was the first time they'd met. Shattering experience of losing an Archbishop of Canterbury as something that never happened before. So they started the whole thing with prayers of penitence and I was quite shocked by that. Andrew, were you as well?
Yeah, I'm kind of arguing a thesis that this might be a time of this might be the church moving into a healthier place, but I do think there's a huge amount of shock. Trauma is probably the wrong word in this context, but there's a great deal of shock in the Church of England in general at these events, and synod was to a certain extent, though it was rebellious and fractious at times, it also felt a little bit flat at times. This was a very odd gathering. Just lost an archbishop. The Archbishop of York is under severe pressure, and I understand very shaken by all events of recent times. So I think the Church of England is wrong-footed, if you like.
One of the main debates that the press were looking forward to was the debate on safeguarding after the events of the last few months, with the talk about what happened in Chelmsford when the Archbishop of York was there and David Tudor, the accusations against the Bishop of Liverpool, and the Macon review, which led to the resignation of Welby. I'm wondering what your view was of how that safeguarding debate went, because they didn't go for independent safeguarding, and that was despite all the senior leaders saying that they should do it.
I think they failed to give that very clear message to the country that they are prepared to go for independent safeguarding. And I think it was a classic synodical fudge where Synod was being offered two options, and it was very clear that they were being told these are two options which are different and where a direction of travel is needed, a pointer to the direction of travel is needed. Are we only going to go for independent scrutiny? And in fact, most people agreed that independent scrutiny was necessary. Or are we going to aim for independent scrutiny and independent operational processes? In the lead up to Synod, there was a lot of noise around what the legal implications of operational independence would be, what the potential issues surrounding the weaponising of safeguarding. There were all sorts of things going on. And I think people got scared and pulled back from 4. And when Philip North, the Bishop of Blackburn, put his, it's not a 3.5 motion, even though that's what he called it. It was a sort of 3 then 4 maybe motion. People grabbed it because it was easier, it was more comfortable, it didn't commit them to things. And I think there were a whole range of reasons why people did that. But I think it's a shame. I think Bishop Joanne Grenfell was very clear. What was needed was a really clear message of either or, and Synod tried to say both and maybe.
I think it was from a PR perspective, certainly it was a misstep for the church. It was, I think, an open opportunity to score, if not necessarily a particularly positive headline, at least not a negative headline. Whereas by going for option 3 or 3.5, as some are calling it, but really kind of, option 3 for the time being, and we'll explore option 4 further. They missed out on that opportunity. It meant that the prominent voices were those of Professor Alexis Jay, sort of saying, the church is not doing well enough in Warshed at Cordova. Also issued a statement afterwards as well, kind of lamenting the decision. And there was, as you say, there was a lot of criticism from survivor and survivor advocates. And I think interestingly as well, it was about a sort of 2/3 split amongst the bishops. And yet if you tally up the bishops who spoke in the debate, far more of them were on the side of Model 4. So it suggests perhaps there was something of a silent majority in Synod, or a quieter majority, let's say, in that was a bit more cautious and maybe a little bit less concerned about the headlines that were going to come out of it.
I think the reason for the success of Philip North's amendment was that the Church of England has been over-promising and under-delivering for far too long. Here's a plan that can be delivered fairly quickly, and a scrutiny body. And while the process of exploring option 4 and whether it's deliverable under charity law it continues to be explored. There was so many doubts around the J proposals.
Those stories that the safeguarding debate were answering were also about clergy discipline, weren't they? What do you do if you have a complaint? And can you sack a vicar? Do you think the improvements that they made, or the changes that they made to the clergy, how clergy are disciplined, are good, or will make an impact? Susie, how do you read them?
Well, I think it's slightly ironic that when it comes to clergy conduct and clergy being investigated, Synod has just agreed that it's really important that the person who is on the ground and assesses the complaint is independent of the diocese. On the other hand, we've said when safeguarding complaints come through, it's really important that the person who's on the ground and investigating the situation is not independent of the diocese. And as safeguarding and clergy conduct matters often overlap, they're certainly not disconnected. I just think it shows that there isn't really joined up thinking in the way in which Synod has voted this time. I think the clergy conduct measure, there's elements of it that are going to be better than the old clergy discipline measure. It couldn't be much worse. It is now going to be possible to, in the sort of words that people use, defrock a priest in the future. That wasn't possible. That hasn't been possible for the last 20 or so years. So I think there are some good things in it, but I think at the end of the day, it always comes down to the quality of those investigating the complaint, the money that's prepared to be spent on actually finding out what happened, and the willingness of the church to take a small bad headline locally rather than cover things up locally and then end up with a massive national scandal.
Another speech that was made, which kind of set things alight, was from Lord Botten, who comes to the end of his term as the Archbishop's Commission on Racial Justice lead. And he, well, the way that we wrote it was he let rip at the Synod. And he talked about the fact that he found it very difficult to, and he called it a little cooperation in getting information to the Commission on racial justice in the church.
Clearly, he doesn't feel the work of the Commission has been taken completely seriously. And, there's some justification for that. The Church of England has been investigating its own racial injustice for decades, and has had numerous reports, and has failed to deal with it. I think it is clearly dealing with it better now, he's making a number of recommendations that the Church of England needs to follow through.
That one's likely to come up again. Thank you for that. Amongst these very dry discussions, there was this wonderful moment when Alex Frost, the vicar from Burnley, who people may remember, it was filmed in that BBC report during the COVID lockdowns, helping the pastor on the street give out food to people in Burnley. I don't know if you saw that report. And anyway, he was already in the public eye, and he's got this thing called the Godcast that he does. And he said that he felt the Church of England should appoint new working class apprentices, because after all, Jesus had done that when he called the disciples, and they were fishermen, and his father was a carpenter and everything else. He's a great character. Did any of you meet him and discuss this with him? What did you make of how he went down?
The church needs the people who are called to serve the church, and some of them are going to be working class, some of them are going to be middle class. I guess, we'll have all sorts of people being called to the church. I agree with Francis, though, that those kinds of debates do tend to just turn into the personal stories, which are lovely to hear and heartwarming or shocking, depending on what, the way in which those debates go. But I understood, I think it was the Bishop of Bath and Wells at the end of Synod, incredibly frustrated that the bill that would have, the motion that would have moved money from central funds to local parishes, which may have made more difference to working class parishes than anything else, we didn't have the time, Synod didn't have the time to debate.
To me, it was one of the most interesting debates. We're not. I think probably our readers are not hugely interested in, but I'm interested in the fact that there's been, there have always been some working class clergy. There's even in recent time, relatively recent times, been a working class archbishop.
Was your father?
Well, my father came from a council estate in Dagenham, left school at the age of 15. And became Archbishop of Canterbury. So, there are those stories. They've been around for a long time. I think there's been a reassertion of privilege, and I think that's more generally in society. I'm surprised I'm coming across as the left winger on the panel, but I think there has been a terrible reassertion of privilege in Britain. And this is one of the things the church should be doing, is kicking out against that.
I was going to ask some questions just as we come towards the end of how you think the Synod has gone down with the public and whether you think that matters.
I went into our local pub on Friday night, having got back from London, and a friend said, where have you been? And I said, I've been up in London reporting on Church of England stuff. And the comment was, oh, you guys are in a lot of trouble, aren't you? You've lost both your archbishops and somebody else and something else. And, no idea at all about what's really going on, and wouldn't know that Synod was happening. And I think we have to recognise that the world out there is not waiting to hear what the Church of England has to say about anything in particular, really. We are the Church of England is a tiny body. It's a tiny group of people. And even the people who go to church on Sundays are rarely interested in what happened at Synod. I can be totally honest. Before I was persuaded by somebody to join General Synod, I didn't even know that it happened. And I had been going to a Church of England church been involved in Church of England church since I was 7. And I think we fool ourselves if we think that the world is waiting for those things. On the other hand, I think we don't do ourselves, Church of England doesn't do itself any favours when things like the assisted dying bill are going through Parliament. And one voice that could have been heard was something to do with that. But we had too much internal business to have an emergency debate on that subject. And so that voice won't be heard within Parliament, and that might have been a helpful one.
I mean, I agree wholly, completely with Susie. I think, but I also think there's in the parishes. I mean, I hear from a lot of clergy that the churches were packed at Christmas, and despite the Archbishop of Canterbury being forced to resign, and these kinds of events don't always have an impact on a local level. I mean, they will over time, inevitably, if the church is if the church can't put its act together on dealing with past safeguarding complaints and dealing with the victims.
I think in terms of how Synod is perceived, I mean, I agree. I think it's obviously of huge importance to the functioning of the church, and major decisions are taken there, and we can't sort of get away from that. But it doesn't have really any cultural cut through, aside from when a particularly major issue is being debated. This was one such synod. On the safeguarding issue, that there was clearly going to be national headlines generated. So yes, it matters in those sort of particular touch point moments, but for the rest of it, it's really the church going about its business.
I mean, I live in a small community, and so therefore have contact with all sorts of different people who know that there are 2 churches in the town, and most of them don't go to either of them. I don't think that what Synod says about things really makes any kind of impact. What does make an impact is whether or not somebody is picked up to go to church or forgotten. And if somebody's forgotten when they were supposed to be being picked up for church, you can be absolutely certain that 50 people will be saying that the church is an uncaring place. It's things happen locally when people discover that the church is supporting and helping local individuals with a food bank, or helping local individuals through difficult times. People say, well, actually, that's the church doing the right thing. So I think, the church is the church.
What you're looking for the headline for the July Synod? What's going to be the main thing that you think will occupy them in July? Francis?
It's a good question. I mean, it will depend a lot on what happens between now and then. It's a possibility that it still hasn't been, so the door hasn't been closed to there being some meaningful sort of further proposals being put forward relating to LLF. But I mean, I think outside of those 2 issues, I think the funding could be an interesting thing. I mean, the Bishop of Bath and Wells motion that Susie mentioned, there wasn't time for, that got sort of cut off on the final day. That could be really impactful.
I mean, I think safeguarding will still be on the agenda in July, and I mean, who knows what Channel 4 will come up with in the week before Synod in July. So I don't think we can rule that out. I think Francis is absolutely right. The unfinished business is the Bishop of Bath and Wells proposals, and that could be quite significant. I do think LLF is going to continue to be kicked into the long grass.
The motion about funding will be serious. I think Save the Parish has got a lot of traction within communities, and I think anything that is talking about the local parish where the churches are being closed or opened. I mean, essentially, we didn't talk about the debate about the pastoral missions, pastoral and missions measure, mission and pastoral measure, which is all about how you close churches or don't close churches. You know, that's what's hitting people on the ground. And so funding for local churches to be able to remain open, I think, is the thing that could hit the headlines next time, or at least is what people would want to know about.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. And see you at the next Synod.